Please join me in prayer. Put a hand on our shoulder and point us in the right direction. Put our hand on someone's shoulder and let it matter. Amen. Benedictine nun Joan Chittister once wrote, "Guests bring us to God, and guests bring the world in. Guests," she continues, "place the world at our feet and dare us to be who and what we say we are." Sister Chittister's comments about guests made me think of a recent story about customer service. The story is told by Chris Hearn, the CEO of a commercial capital firm, but in this case, he shared his story not as a CEO, but as a guest. "Most people," writes Hearn, "have experienced outstanding customer service in one form or another. An attentive server at a restaurant or a retail store employee who goes the extra mile. At my company, we've always pushed our employees to go the extra mile for clients because outstanding customer service has ripple effects. Recently," he continues, "my family and I experienced signature customer service at a hotel in a way that will be talked about in our family and at my company for many years to come. My wife and 2 children spent a few days at Amelia Island in Florida while I was in California on business, sadly unable to make the trip with them. Upon returning, we discovered that our son's beloved stuffed giraffe named Joshi had gone missing. As most parents know, children can become quite attached to special blankets, teddy bears, and the like. My son is extremely fond of his Joshi and was absolutely distraught when faced with the idea of going to sleep without his favorite pal. While trying to put him to bed that first night home, I decided to tell a little white lie. 'Joshi is fine,' I said. 'He's just taking an extra long vacation at the resort.' My son seemed to buy it and was finally able to fall asleep, Joshi-less. That very night," writes Hearn, "the hotel where my family had stayed called to tell us they had Joshi. Thankfully, he'd been found, no worse for wear, in the laundry and was handed over to the hotel's loss prevention team. I came clean to the staff about the story I told my son and asked if they would mind taking a picture of Joshi on a lounge chair by the pool to substantiate my fabricated story. The loss prevention team said they'd do it, and I hung up the phone very relieved. A couple of days went by and we received a package from the hotel. It was my son's Joshi, along with some hotel-branded goodies, a frisbee, a football, etc. Also included in the package was a binder that meticulously documented Joshi's extended stay at the hotel. In the binder were pictures. One picture was of Joshi wearing sunglasses while sunning himself on a beach chair. Another was of Joshi getting a massage with cucumber slices over his eyes. Another picture was of Joshi sitting beside other stuffed animals with a caption that read, "Joshi making friends." There was a shot of Joshi the giraffe sitting in the driver's seat of a golf cart. And the last picture was of him sitting in front of a computer screen after being made an honorary member of the loss prevention team. He was even given an ID badge as proof. Needless to say, writes Hearn, my wife and I were completely wowed by the loss prevention team. My son, on the other hand, didn't care much about the binder of photos and was just happy to have his pal back. The lesson Hearn learned from this experience was, in his words, to work to create an experience so amazing that someone can't help but tell others about it. Guests, writes Benedictine nun Joan Chittister, place the world at our feet and dare us to be who and what we say we are. All 3 of our scripture readings for this morning deal with hospitality, deal with being hosts to guests, which is a timely topic for us today as we dedicate our kitchen downstairs and as we celebrate together World Communion Sunday, a day when we, along with Christians around the world, are celebrating the universality of our faith, the universalism of our faith tradition, which recognizes, to quote the 3rd century theologian Origen of Alexandria, that God is everywhere and in all things, including especially in the faces of the guests we welcome. In today's reading from Genesis, Abraham and Sarah play host to God. The setting of the story is somewhere near the ancient city of Sodom, a city with, we might say, a fiery history. For not long after eating with Abraham and Sarah, God rains down fire and brimstone on Sodom and its neighboring city, Gomorrah, and turns them into ash. God is heading to Sodom with two other individuals when the three of them stop to visit Abraham and Sarah. The two other mysterious individuals traveling with God are called angels later in Genesis, but some ancient Christian theologians couldn't resist seeing the three travelers as members of the Holy Trinity. Whoever they were all strangers to Abraham, and when he sees the three of them appear on the horizon, he leaps to his feet and runs to greet them. Bowing with his face to the ground before his guests, Abraham invites them in to soak their sore feet as he and Sarah prepare a feast: breads, meat, and a yogurt dish to dip the bread into. There were no refrigerators back then to pull stuff out of, spur of the moment. All this food is made from scratch while the guests lounge in the shade. It's an extraordinary display of hospitality. Abraham and Sarah playing host to God and to a couple of God's friends. The purpose of this story in Genesis chapter 18 is to contrast this display of welcome with the simmering rage in the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, a rage that led the residents of Sodom to try to attack the angels who traveled with God instead of treating them as guests, as Abraham and Sarah did. The Hebrew prophet Ezekiel in today's second reading said, "The sin of Sodom, the sin that brought fire down from heaven, was hoarding their wealth and prosperity and not sharing it with the poor in their midst or the guest at their door." Or to put that differently, if the people of Sodom were in charge of that hotel Chris Hearns' family visited, I suspect Joshi would never have been seen again. These stories in Genesis contrast Sodom and Gomorrah's rage and bullying that treats visitors at their gates as objects to fear and hate. Genesis contrasts this lack of hospitality with the hospitality shown by Abraham and Sarah to the three travelers at their door, a hospitality that welcomes strangers as guests and goes the extra mile to make them as comfortable as possible. The one is driven by fear, the other by love. In the Hulu series based on Margaret Atwood's novel, The Handmaid's Tale, there's a scene in episode 10 that illustrates these contrasting hospitalities. The protagonist is June Osborne, who is a handmaid along with many other women living in a post-apocalyptic America called Gilead. Gilead has reduced women's rights as human beings to their function in the home and reduced handmaids' rights to mere procreation. Gilead is portrayed as a heterosexual male fantasyland. June Osborne's best friend is Moira, who is also a handmaid. In episode 10, Moira escapes the horrors of Gilead and flees in the care of an underground railroad of sorts to Canada. As a refugee, Moira is treated as a welcome guest north of the border. The scene begins with a camera shot from behind her, which pans closer. Moira is seated at a table with a warm winter coat on. A Canadian caseworker sits down beside her, offers her coffee and something to eat. "Welcome to Ontario," he says. "I wish it was under different circumstances, but we're happy to have you here," he continues. Moira looks stunned. No man treated her this kindly in Gilead. The hospitable welcome continues. The caseworker asks if Moira has any family in Canada because they have a text message system that can notify all family members of her arrival. He then gives her a refugee ID badge. He gives her an envelope with all her paperwork filled out. He gives her a cell phone, all paid up. He gives her money to help her get settled. He gives her a medical insurance card, a prescription drug card. He even gives her a bag of clean clothes. Moira is overwhelmed by this Abraham and Sarah type of welcome. "Do you want more to eat?" he asks gently. "Do you want a book to sit somewhere quiet?" he asks. "Whatever you need," he says. Abraham and Sarah type hospitality helps to soothe the horrors of a human being's past. It goes the extra mile to treat a person as a welcome guest, like that hotel treated Chris Hearns' family. And such hospitality has deep roots in Christian history. In today's New Testament reading from Romans, St. Paul gives several shout-outs to hosts and guests among the early Christian network of churches. He begins by holding up a woman named Phoebe. "I commend to you our sister Phoebe," he writes. English translators for centuries have mistranslated Phoebe's official title in the churches. The Revised English Bible calls Phoebe the good friend of Paul. The New King James Bible calls her Paul's helper, as does the Revised Standard Version. Our NRSV Pew Bible translates the Greek word correctly by calling Phoebe Paul's benefactor. Phoebe financed Paul's ministry. She was a wealthy, independent woman in antiquity. More than a mere good friend or a helper, she paid for the food on Paul's table and the clothes on his back, and did so for many others in the early Christian movement. Paul goes on in this chapter at the end of Romans to greet several other people and to convey their greetings to the Roman Christians, name after name of hosts and guests. And then at the end of today's reading, Paul gives a special shout out to a man named Gaius, calling him the host to me and to the whole church. A scholar friend of mine has pointed out in print that this is a mistranslation of Gaius's role. Gaius wasn't a host, argues my friend Rick. Gaius was a guest. The Greek word translated as host is the word xenos, where we get our word xenophobia from, fear of others. The main reason for translating xenos as guest instead of as host is that the word xenos in antiquity almost always referred to a human being who was an other, an outsider, a foreigner, someone who visited, instead of someone who hosted visitors. If my friend Rick is right about this, then Paul, in the midst of sending greetings and acknowledging many individuals by name at the end of this ancient letter, is highlighting one guest in particular. Perhaps Gaius was a recent visitor to the church. Perhaps Gaius filled out a pew card. Perhaps he entered the church on a Sunday morning with the stink of the world all over him, laden with burdens he needed support to carry. Perhaps Gaius was gender fluid or queer. Perhaps Gaius's life was transformed when he entered those doors and was greeted with Abraham and Sarah type hospitality. Maybe he was invited to a dish-to-pass meal after the service. Maybe he was handed an invitation by a child after the children's sermon, welcoming him to the communion table. Maybe someone reached out to him personally during the passing of the peace. Or maybe those first-century Christians greeted him with an ancient version of the UCC's, "No matter who you are, no matter where you are on life's journey, you, Gaiuses of the world, are welcome here." Whatever it was, Gaius as a guest instead of as a host put those early Christians to the test. In the words I began with this morning from Benedictine nun Joan Chittister, "Guests bring us to God," she said, "and guests bring the world in. Guests," she says, "place the world at our feet and dare us to be who and what we say we are." The prophetic call to us on this World Communion Sunday, the call to action, is found, I think, in those words. Guests dare us to be who and what we say we are. Without guests, writes Joan Chittister, life here is just one more instance of securing ourselves in the midst of our people, our kind, our type. The guest, she says, stretches our hearts. Guests open us to the possibility, as Abraham and Sarah discovered, that God has come for a visit in the faces of the strangers in our midst and the guests at our doors. And guests challenge us to offer Abraham and Sarah type hospitality instead of Sodom and Gomorrah's lack of it. And it's a prophetic message for our country at this time of America First ideology, this time of dismissing with the wave of a hand the stories of survivors, this time of locking little children in cages. This is Sodom and Gomorrah's fear of the other, not Abraham and Sarah's generous openness. Let me close this morning with a story told to me by a pastor friend. My friend once invited an immigrant from Germany to a healing service at their church. She was a student visiting for the academic year, and she was struggling to make connections. She attended the healing service where my friend lit a candle and said a prayer. He then passed the flame to another person, who passed it to another, and on it went. The German student's candle was also lit. But there was one person, a visitor, a guest, sitting in the back whose candle remained unlit. No one seemed to notice except the German student. She got up from the pew, walked to the back, and lit the man's candle. After the service, my friend thanked her for her kindness and asked her why she acted in that way. Because he was forgotten, she said. My takeaway from that story is the same takeaway that Chris Hearn in the Joshi the Giraffe story had. Welcoming a guest, showing hospitality to a guest, has ripple effects and means that no one will be forgotten. Amen.